Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. And today we're going deep on heroes and shadows.
Ooh.
How comic books, and particularly Batman, deal with this idea of justice through, I guess you could say, vigilante ethics.
Absolutely. And, right off the bat,
Mm,
I think it's really important for us to remember
yeah.
that we're not talking about, like legal definitions or going super deep into, scholarly articles or anything like that.
Right.
Our sources today are really just meant to be jumping off points for, our own thoughts and ideas and to kind of, stretch our understanding of things.
Yeah.
So think of this as like an open playground,
I love that.
There's no right or wrong answers.
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah.
interesting ways to think about these things.
Yeah, and we're aiming for a light touch on some of these topics that,
Sure.
could be a little heavier and hopefully, find some moments of aha and maybe even a few laughs along the way.
Absolutely.
Because, when you think about it, this deep dive, it's kind of inspired by, Batman's nightly escapades and how these seemingly small, creative acts, like, him fighting crime
Right.
and his own particular brand of community involvement and this constant pursuit of justice, that can actually help us cut through that feeling of being totally overwhelmed and maybe even offer a little bit of hope and resilience.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, it's...
Let's dig into this idea of justice and the vigilante.
Yeah, the vigilante thing, it's so interesting.
Yeah.
Because the central tension that we see playing out in Gotham, I think, is one that we see reflected in societies, all over the world, which is what happens when the established systems, the things that are designed to deliver justice,
Right.
are perceived as failing.
Right.
Or just inadequate.
Yeah.
And I think this perceived inadequacy, creates a space,
Yeah.
almost a demand for these figures who operate outside of those boundaries.
Yeah.
We call them vigilantes.
And when you think of vigilantes, I mean, Batman is the poster child.
Oh, yeah. Right? He's masked, he's moving in the shadows, he's delivering his own brand of justice.
Right.
So what fuels that kind of commitment?
Yeah.
And when you look at his origin story, I mean, it's so rooted in personal tragedy.
Right.
The senseless murder of his parents.
Yeah.
And he sees that as a symptom of, Gotham itself, like a system that failed him.
Absolutely. I mean, that personal wound, right? It's like
Yeah.
the initial spark.
Yeah.
And it provides this intense and almost relentless drive.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really fascinating to look at Machiavelli from The Prince.
Okay.
And he famously debated whether it's more effective to be loved or feared
Mm-hmm.
as a leader.
Yeah.
And he came down pretty heavily on the side of fear
Yeah.
as being the more, stable and reliable tool.
Okay.
And when we look at Gotham, how does that play out with Batman? Is he loved? Is he feared? Is it some kind of cocktail of both?
Right?
Because Machiavelli argues that love is fickle. It can change.
Right.
And fear, when consistently applied, can be a much more stable form of control.
Right. Yeah. It definitely feels like fear is part of his, arsenal.
Right.
Like the criminals in Gotham are terrified of him.
Yeah.
But then you also see that the citizens look to the bat signal with herp.
Right.
Like there's someone who's fighting for them when the normal channels aren't working.
Exactly.
So it is this really complex dynamic.
It is.
So let's kind of pivot a little bit because we have Swami Nirmalananda in Being Here Now. And he talks about how true beingness is about engaging with life, not escaping it.
Okay.
It's embracing both quiet reflection and active participation.
Okay.
So is Batman's crusade this profound form of engagement, or could it be seen as withdrawal, a retreat into, the shadows?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Because on the surface, I mean, his actions are the definition of engagement.
Right.
Confronting criminals head on.
He's not being passive.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But he does deliberately isolate himself.
Right.
He's not working within the, the structures of society. And the Swami talks about people who, wimp out on life.
Okay.
And so you have to wonder, does Batman's almost monastic devotion to his mission fit that description? Or is it, a totally unique form of engagement?
Right.
Because it's driven by such an incredible sense of responsibility.
He does have connections, though.
He does.
I mean, you have Alfred,
Yeah.
you have Commissioner Gordon, you have the Robins.
But it's all in the context of Batman.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what about this idea of living in the present moment?
Okay.
That's also from Being Here Now.
Right.
And the text describes it as like a gift,
Oh.
unburdened by the past, anxieties about the future,
Right.
and a vigilante like Batman who's constantly reacting to immediate threats
Sure.
seems to embody that in some ways. He's
Yeah.
always dealing with the crime that's happening right now.
Right.
Right, the immediate danger.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of that.
Yeah.
Like his focus in the moment
Mm-hmm.
tends to be on whatever threat is right in front of him.
Yeah, right.
However, you can't escape the fact that his entire mission is fueled by this past trauma, losing his parents.
Yeah.
And everything he does is about preventing future tragedies.
Right.
So in a way, even though his tactics might be reactive and present-focused, his underlying motivation is all about the past and the future.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So that leads us to this critical and potentially unsettling aspect of vigilantism, and that's the risk that it becomes its own kind of oppressive force, its own brand of injustice.
Oh, yeah.
And Machiavelli in The Prince, he argues that the outcome can justify the methods and even suggests, pretty ruthless actions if they lead to stability and order.
Wow.
So where do we draw the line? How do we reconcile that with our fundamental ideas of justice?
Machiavelli brings up such a great point.
Yeah.
Because he forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths.
Yeah.
Like, if effectiveness is the only measure,
Right.
then actions that we would normally see as wrong can be rationalized.
Yeah.
If they achieve a desired outcome, like reducing crime.
Right.
But I think the real question is, who gets to decide what those desirable outcomes are?
That's a great question.
And what methods are acceptable?
Yeah.
Because without those checks and balances that a legal system provides,
Right.
A vigilante wields a tremendous amount of power.
Yeah.
And even with the purest of intentions, that power is, ripe for abuse.
Yeah.
And then the definition of justice becomes totally subjective.
It does.
It's in the hands of the person who has the power.
Wow.
Yeah.
And thinking about the nature of crime itself, are prisons obsolete? This excerpt discusses, how tough on crime policies.
Yeah.
And that huge surge in incarceration during the Reagan era didn't actually make communities safer.
Right.
It seemed to mainly fuel the growth of the prison industrial complex.
Yeah.
So how does Batman's approach fit into that? Is he actually tackling the root causes of crime in Gotham, or is he just reacting to symptoms?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because he focuses so much on apprehending criminals, often through force and intimidation. And while that might offer a temporary, a temporary sense of security and make people feel safe in the short term, it's not addressing those underlying societal issues.
Right.
Poverty, lack of opportunity, inequality.
Yeah.
These are the things that lead to crime in the first place.
Yeah.
And so while Batman's methods are, dramatic, they don't actually touch those problems.
So he's working within a broken system.
He is.
And just trying to kind of patch it up.
Yeah, he's like putting Band-Aids on, on bullet holes.
Instead of doing surgery.
Yeah,
exactly.
Right. And it makes you think about, what would a lasting solution look like?
Absolutely.
And a checklist for ending tyranny highlights the historical, significance of civil resistance against these oppressive regimes and points out that nonviolent movements have often been more frequent.
And ultimately more successful than violent uprisings.
Okay.
So how does Batman's often violent approach, compare to this trend?
Yeah, it's a stark contrast.
Yeah.
The checklist emphasizes strength in numbers, the power of nonviolent discipline and civilian participation.
Yeah.
These things are super effective in actually shifting power dynamics.
Right.
Whereas Batman's a lone wolf.
He is.
Yeah.
And he relies on force and fear.
Right. And, and that idea of nonviolent discipline is so important.
Yeah.
Because the checklist points out that maintaining that discipline maximizes participation and increases the chances of the opposition wavering.
Right.
Whereas Batman's methods, while maybe effective, in those individual situations, might alienate people, and they certainly don't encourage some kind of moral awakening in the, criminal underworld.
Yeah, fear is a very different motivator.
It is than, principled resistance. Because nonviolent resistance works by shifting the narrative, appealing to people's conscience.
Yeah.
Their self-interest, even those within the system.
Right.
Batman's approach is, overwhelming force and intimidation.
Yeah.
Which,
gets the job done, but
it gets the job done, but does it actually change anything in the long term?
Long term. Okay.
Yeah.
So this changes everything, talks about power, not just energy, and argues that social and political context is what ultimately changes the status quo.
Hmm.
and that technological solutions alone aren't enough.
Right.
And Batman is so well known for his gadgets and technology.
Yeah.
Is he using this technology to actually address the power structures of Gotham, like the corruption?
Right.
Or is he just a high-tech solution in a broken system?
Yeah, it seems like the latter. You know,
Yeah.
his technology lets him fight crime
Mm-hmm.
on the street level
Mm-hmm.
in a really efficient way.
Right.
But it doesn't actually change the systemic issues.
Yeah. He's really good at managing the symptoms.
He is.
Yeah, but the disease is still there.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
corruption,
Yeah.
the inequality, all that stuff is still in place.
Yeah, and the text really argues that real change requires engaging with that social and political context.
Absolutely.
And that's something that, Batman's focus on individual criminals doesn't really address.
Doesn't really allow for it.
Right.
Dumb.
So moving on then to this idea of Batman and this mood of hope,
Okay.
because despite all these complexities and downsides of his methods, he still resonates as this powerful symbol of hope
Oh, yeah.
for so many people in Gotham and for us as, readers and viewers.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we reconcile that?
I think this goes back to our core idea.
Yeah.
The power of small creative acts
Yeah.
to affirm our struggles and offer a glimmer of hope.
Okay.
Because his nightly fight, even if it doesn't eradicate crime,
Right.
can be seen as this constant series of small victories against impossible odds.
Yeah.
And for the average person in Gotham to see that bat signal,
Yeah.
it's a sign that someone is out there fighting.
Someone's on their side.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's that feeling too of, pain feels big, but it's beatable.
Yeah.
And that really shines through in Batman's resilience.
Mm-hmm.
He's faced so much darkness and loss, but he keeps fighting.
Yeah.
And that's hopeful.
Yeah, that perseverance is
Yeah.
powerful.
It shows that even the deepest wounds don't have to be the end.
Absolutely. And, while he's working in the shadows, he's not totally isolated.
Right. He's got his community.
He does. He's got his allies.
Commissioner Gordon Alfred the Robins.
Yeah. And the map to abundance talks about finding support in your desired reality. And these relationships, even though they're unusual,
Yeah.
provide that support and strength.
Right.
So it shows that even on the darkest crusade, you still need that connection.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
So as a symbol then,
Yeah.
Batman becomes more than just this crime fighter.
He does.
He represents this idea that even in a place as messed up as Gotham, hardship doesn't have to be permanent.
Yeah.
With critical thinking, with action.
Right.
There's a possibility for change.
Absolutely.
It's a really powerful narrative,
It is.
even with all of its,
Yeah.
contradictions.
So I think what we see from our deep dive into justice through Batman
Yeah.
is this really complex web of contradictions.
Yeah.
Right? You have the individual action versus systemic change.
Right.
You have fear versus community and shared purpose.
Right.
You have violent intervention versus nonviolent resistance.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
And that leads us with a question for you to think about.
Oh.
Given these different perspectives on justice and power and how change happens,
Yeah.
what does true justice look like in our world? And what role do these figures who operate outside of the system,
The vigilantes.
yeah, what role do they play?
Yeah.
Is Batman a symbol of hope or a reminder of despair?
Wow.
It's something to wrestle with.
It is.
Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Take care. Yeah, you too.